Well, good evening, everyone. How's everyone doing tonight? Well, I am elated at the turnout tonight. I am Andrew Kercher. I am from Port Huron. I am a local historian here. Historian by training, bookmobilist by trade these days. But delighted to see all of you come out because you're presumably interested in Port Huron history like I am. So you're after my own heart. This is one of my favorite topics. Now, before we dive in, when I first was talking about this, I talked with James Freed, city manager of Port Huron, and I've got his number. We text on occasion. He asks me history questions sometimes, and well, he was asking me about the Harvey Center here that you're in. Has recently, kind of the day-to-day operations have been taken over by the city. This building was actually built by the Port Huron Housing Commission many, many years ago. It's been a number of different things, so I'll actually talk a little bit about that in the lecture. But the city, if you haven't been following along, took over the day-to-day operations. They're eventually, I think, attempting to buy the building, but everything is a federal case because it was the Housing and Urban Development. So this is stuff that's got to run through Washington, D.C. before it's a done deal. But one of the things they've done an amazing job in the makeover. So the city, James Freed, Cynthia, the council, everyone's kind of been working together along with Parks and Rec that have been really opening this building up to all of the cool new events. And one of the goals that James talked to me about was yeah, let's have a lecture there. Anything we can do to get people inside who haven't maybe been there before to know that there is this cool resource in our city. So I'm very curious. Put your hand up if you've never been in this building before. So that is easily more than half, right? So there's many, many of us who haven't been inside. Now you get to see this after a really cool kind of renovation, and one of these cool assets that we have within the city. So follow along. I know Parks and Rec posts about a lot of things they do. They've got a lot of brochures out at kind of the front door, maybe on your way out. Check some of those out. Check out some of the things they've got going on in here. There's a bunch of clubs that meet over here. Some really cool stuff. So I'm very thankful for my partners at the city for having me out, because I'll tell you, it is a great honor to get to talk about my hometown in my hometown. So as many of you probably can guess, if you work at a museum like I did for many years, I work at the library now, driving the bookmobile. It is a nice gig, but you don't take that if you have a lust for money and power. So I instead, my side hustle is I speak all over the state. I go to libraries I've never heard of up in the pinky and the ring finger. I spend a lot of time in Metro Detroit. Last year I spoke at 83 different libraries all around the state. So I spent a lot of time on the road. It's my second job doing that, and I enjoy doing it. But boy, any chance I get when I can speak about such a cool spot, I love Port Huron, as hopefully you'll see in this history, and any opportunity I get to speak about it in my own hometown, I love being a cheerleader for this place, because I think we live in a really amazing place, and sometimes people don't realize just how cool things are here tonight. So my last caveat before we actually dive into the slides, one of my goals when I set out for this talk, we're of course talking about the South Side. If you know anything about Port Huron, you know that the North Side tends to get a lot of the attention, right? And a lot of people, I imagine, I know some of you live on the North Side. I know many of you live on the South Side. Sometimes there's a little bit of a divide in the town, but I think the South Side has some really unique, some really cool stories that maybe haven't gone quite mainstream in town, right? So it's the rare Port Huron lecture where we won't be talking about Thomas Edison or the bridge or any of that. North of the river, we don't care about that tonight, right? So, no, but my goal was to kind of give you this view from 30,000 feet. I picked out a few stories. These are not by any stretch of the imagination. I can tell that this would happen beforehand, because for weeks leading up to this, as people heard about this, they said, well, Andrew, you're going to talk about this, right? You're going to include my favorite story, right? Or you got to talk about that. And I was like, look, I got 45-ish minutes, right? We got maybe an hour at the outside. I know exactly the endurance level of the human butt in these very comfortable metal chairs. So we do not have all night. We're not going to fit in every single story. I'm going to give you guys some of the highlights, maybe some of the stories you've heard before, some hopefully you haven't. I threw in a couple like little tidbits. They're just some of my favorites. But my goal is to make you more interested in our history and want to find out more, want to dig a little bit deeper into some of these stories. And at the end, we'll talk a little bit about some of the resources that are out there, because we are blessed with a bountiful number of resources about Port Huron area history within our community that you can go to find some of those out. But all that out of the way, let's dive in just a little bit here, right? We're talking about, I love this map, Port Huron City as opposed to Port Huron Township there. This is kind of an older map. Do you think we could dim the lights maybe a little bit more? Would that be cool? Would that help people? That looks a little washed out, maybe just a little bit, right? It'll be very theatrical here if we take those down at the front. A little better, getting better? Much better? Okay, how about that? Do we want to go for gold? Can we? Sound good, right? Good, perfect. Okay, so we got Port Huron City here. Again, we're going to be talking about that south half, as we know. I guess I always design my lectures with the idea in mind that someone coming in knows basically nothing about the subject, but I have to assume you all know a little bit about Port Huron, right? You know like where you are tonight, right? We are south, of course, of the Black River, kind of dividing the city that way. But if we go back a very long time, of course, the first residents of the south side, the first residents of any part of Port Huron are the Indigenous people. I love this map. A lot of Indigenous maps, especially for like woodland natives, are oriented with east towards the front. There's no reason north has to be the top of the map, right? So it's always good to get one of these and be like, huh? And you're like cranking your head sideways. But of course, Indigenous people have called Michigan, they've called areas like Port Huron home since time immemorial. And there are a number of different groups that have lived here, passed through. These are some cool little Waganogans. So they kind of look like a teepee, but they're a little bit smaller. You make them out of birch bark. Very common among the Anishinaabe. And they're one of the biggest groups. The Anishinaabe are one of the groups that are living here in the 18th century, when some of the first Europeans would arrive. Again, this is a story that goes back thousands of years, but the Anishinaabe were an alliance of Algonquin-speaking people, so they all speak the same language. There are groups like the Odawa, the Ojibwa, the Potawatomi. So not only the cultural alliance, they're a military alliance, right? So there are definitely wars and things like that going on in ancient times. Like the Haudenosaunee from upstate New York a couple of times displaced the people here in Michigan and drove them out. In fact, one of my favorite stories, and this is a story that was many, many decades of oral tradition before it became a written tradition with Daniel Harrington when he was here. This is D.B. Harrington of like the Harrington Hotel fame. That's also named for him. He'll pop up a couple times. But Harrington wrote this from a guy named Nimiskans. And Nimiskan, which meant kind of lightning, was the son of Kiaskans, who had served under Sinclair on garrison duty back in the 18th century, and was quite an old man. And they said that Nimiskan had lived to be something like 112. They didn't have birth certificates or anything back then. But Nimiskan told the story of his father, that there were, in the 17th century, a series of wars called the Beaver Wars. And the Beaver Wars were proxy wars for the United Kingdom and France. And so they armed up all of their allies, and they would fight that war kind of for them. And during this conflict, groups like the Haudenosaunee had pushed almost all of the native people here in Michigan out of their area. Michigan became a burned over area in the Beaver Wars. And they had been pushed as far as some of the Odawa were fighting people on the Great Plains. They were going out into the Lakota, the Dakota territory, fighting the Siouan peoples. And they said, this is crazy. If we're going to fight somebody, let's fight over the land we want. Let's fight over Michigan rather than out here on the Great Plains. And so Kiaskans would come back. And as he would arrive back in this area, they would descend upon the Haudenosaunee. They said where the Black River met the St. Clair River, right here in the middle of Port Huron. And there was a huge battle. It took place over 3 days. Dozens, if not hundreds, killed in this battle. It was so big that they actually dug a huge burial mound. A lot of the natives around here weren't really into burial mounds, at least relatively recently, like the 18th century, in special circumstances. They preferred individual burials, but in a time like this, they wanted to pursue the Haudenosaunee back to New York and follow up on their victory. And they said that there were so many of them when they were coming down in this big war party, they were coming down from the Sioux. They said that after they had beaten the Haudenosaunee and they were chasing them back to New York, they took the canoes down. And this is a sketch from like the 1830s of some of these really big canoes that could be 20, 30, 40 feet long. And as they were in the canoes paddling, they said the first canoe, when it entered Lake St. Clair, the last canoe in the war train was still in Lake Huron. There were that many that had come down, filled the entire length of St. Clair River. But they had won that great victory. It's kind of interesting, that mound that they find this much, much, much later. In the 1870s, when they're digging out the foundation for the federal building downtown, that's exactly where the mound is. There's a whole lot of like really interesting irony in like a U.S. federal building, like disturbing a native burial mound, but that's where they're like, hey, how come we keep finding like hundreds of bones here? Like we're finding this was unmarked and it had really eroded and they hadn't dug anything out with a great big basement before. So again, there's a very, very long and interesting history with this. I love one of the stories they talk about. Keeskant's guy who wrote all of this down or told this story to Daniel Harrington to write down. They said he was 105 years old, 5.5 feet tall, energetic and capable of attending to his cornfield 4 miles south of the Black River. So right down here, right? So as well as the chase every year. Every New Year's Day, he was accustomed to sail down the river in his large birchen canoe, on the bow of which he would fling a giant American flag on the breeze and don a big gold lace jacket and let out a shout as he went up and down the river. Everybody saw him. So this is what gets recorded about one of these very early South Side residents. Like the dude's planting corn here. So he's living here all the way back into the 18th century and into the early 19th century when he will eventually tell that exact story down to Mr. Harrington. So lots of different groups like the Odawa, the Ojibwe, like I said, they live all over Michigan, but of course, the big change in history is going to be when the Europeans arrive. So the first Europeans to paddle through this area, there are people like Jean Nicolet. Nicolet would paddle through eventually the Straits of Mackinac. He was heading west all the way back in 1615. So this is like 5 years before the Pilgrims, right? If we want to put that into a context, we sometimes forget just how far back that French colonial history in this area goes, very far back. And Nicolet has brought his silk robe. They said he landed on the far side of the lakes. He was expecting to meet the Chinese emperor. He eventually wanted to find, a shortcut to the Pacific and get to China. He did not meet the Chinese emperor because he was in fact in Green Bay, Wisconsin. So he was a little off on his journey, right? He didn't make it there, but he found something very important to this area as well. He found beaver fur. So fur-bearing animals, lots of cute and cuddly animals that make very impressive hats. And you can make all sorts of different hats out of beaver fur. You can make like the George Washington, you can do the Napoleon. Even the hat I wore today is a fur felt fedora. So very, very valuable stuff, suffice to say. And so the French were very interested in taking this territory. I love this map from the middle of the 18th century, and it really shows Michigan's importance right in the dead center of this map. As the trade goods make their way from Europe down the river, furs are gathered from around the Great Lakes. They meet at places like Michilimackinac and Detroit and do a lot of that trading. So there's a little bit of trapping in this area. There aren't a ton of people who are living here. They talk about there being like a summer village. Occasionally people are hanging out for a few months. That's the big thing with an indigenous populations. They're highly mobile, right? Our population's very mobile today. I bet you all know some snowbirds. Maybe you've just come back from Florida yourself, right? There's lots of people who move in and out of the territory. Same kind of thing in the 18th century. But the French realized the strategic importance of not only the Great Lakes, but specifically here, Port Huron. By 1686, they would actually build a little fort here, Fort St. Joseph. We don't know what it looked like, and boy, if there's one thing I'm annoyed at the French at, is they name just about every fort Fort St. Joseph. There are at least 5 of them around the Great Lakes, and it sure makes research on them very difficult. But you've probably seen this green marker right around the bridge. They have not found where Fort St. Joseph is. We know that it was probably right there at the mouth of the river. That's where it would make sense strategically to put a couple of cannons and build a little fort. Archaeologically, they've dug up Fort Gratiot, but they have never found Fort St. Joseph. So I always hope every single year I'll get a Facebook message from somebody saying, hey, I found this weird old button in my garden or something. Can you tell me what it is? And maybe we'll find it, right? So it's still out there. So gardeners, you've got a job to look for those French artifacts in your garden. But the French would be here for just a couple of years. I will tell you very briefly my absolute favorite little one-off story. In 1686, in 87, when the French are here, at one point during the summer, they arrest a Dutch fur trader who's coming by. It's one of those other colonial powers we've kind of forgotten about. And they arrest him on like one count of like being Dutch. And they're just like, you're not allowed here, buddy. But he was coming from New Amsterdam. He was coming from, before it was New York, it was a Dutch colony. And so I've always, like, if they ever bring back the Feast of the St. Clair, I think I might have to put together the outfit of the Dutch guy who spent a summer here in jail in the 1680s. I'm like, look, I'm just trying to like sell these beads, man. Like, I got arrested by the French here in town. The French would head back. They would leave Michigan or leave Port Huron, head up to places like Mackinac and Detroit, and would largely make, again, large claims throughout the 18th century politically on North America. Now, I know you will find this hard to believe, but this is like the 1750s. You know, the French have this enormous claim on the blue territory. The British claim this red area. There are millions of residents. The British and the French don't like each other very much. It's no surprise that they would probably wind up in a couple of colonial wars, but the biggest one of all is something called the French and Indian War. And this is a war that they are fighting over Ohio, of all places. Why anyone would do that is truly a mystery to me, but they would fight over Ohio, and it would actually become a global conflict. So this would lead to war back in Europe. It would lead to war in the Caribbean. It would even lead to fighting in places like India. Can you imagine the indignity of being like stepped on by an elephant at a battle in India because somebody wants Ohio? Like, just awful, right? But this war goes very well for the British by the end. They're able to take Quebec. This is a major chokehold, and this is how Michigan becomes British. It's not too long afterwards that we have all of these, you know, nasty tax riots, right? The Doodles don't like paying their taxes. There's some rebel propaganda for you. A Declaration of Independence that we're all kind of familiar about with the 250 years this year, and the American Revolution, right? We're flying through a lot of this because not a lot's happening in Port Huron. That's what we're here to talk about. So, you know, we have the end of the war. There is a treaty. I love this treaty painting here because the British would not sit down for the painting. They just got up and left. So it's unfinished. But we can see, you know, Ben Franklin's there, and the British were like, no thanks, we're leaving. So the Treaty of Paris is what finally made Michigan part of the United States. We were part of the old Northwest Territory. And so you start to see at this point, there are a few like French farmers who have like trickled up to this area. They're in St. Clair County. They're along places like the Pine River at the Pinery down in St. Clair, and a couple that might be living here in Port Huron. Some of those records are a little splotchy. You know, one of the big things that we really start to get any kind of official paperwork all comes from land surveying. So it's the Ordinance of 1787 that would actually divide up the Old Northwest into the states that we get today. And that's its own whole, I think, super interesting story. But even with the Constitution, they ratify all of that in 1789. They're out drawing all of these squares to section up these old places. And this is like the township and range surveys that they do. So that's why most of St. Clair County are these big square like Lynn Township or Riley Township. And it's just a 6 mile by 6 mile square. But you do have some of these little cities that are recognized, just like Port Huron. So Port Huron, one of the first times that any of this area gets surveyed is finally in 1816. So just after the War of 1812, they finally sent like the surveyors out to start dividing things up. And about 1807 too, this area was still unceded native territory. So we've talked about the indigenous people who are living here. It's the Treaty of Detroit in 1807 that they would actually cede this land over to the United States government with the acknowledgement of a couple of different reservations that we'll talk a little bit about. Here's a very cursed map. This is very, very briefly, for only about a year, all of Michigan is in Wayne County, Indiana. We're Indiana territory. That's horrifying to me, so we'll move on. So we get, you know, Michigan territory, and they start adding counties. We get like Wayne County. For a little while, there's like a mega Macomb County that we're in, and it's finally in 1822 that we get a St. Clair County that actually looks not too dissimilar from the St. Clair County we live in today. And by 1832, like at one point, this is if you want to like make St. Clair County great again, at one point we had all of the thumb, right? It was huge. But this was kind of the territory finally that they would settle on. And again, they're drawing these lines and starting to attract people from around the East Coast to move to this area. One of the first big major economic drivers for what would become Port Huron is Detroit burns to the ground in 1803. So as Detroit would suffer this terrible fire, it's actually something that's still on their flag. It says, from the ashes we rise, resurgent nervous, right? We hope for better things. They have this massive fire, and there's an immediate call for a huge amount of wood. And so you start to see people making their way up into the thumb to cut lumber, to rebuild places like Detroit. And some people just say like, hey, my house burned down in Detroit. I was kind of sick of living there anyway. This is the excuse to be a fresh start. So all of this is kind of right in the era right before the War of 1812. As I mentioned before, 1807, this is one of that very first survey maps we were talking about in 1816. We could see this was actually a huge reservation. This is another one of these south side parts of history, because there's the Black River. All of this was initially reservation for like the Swan Creek and Black River Band of Chippewa that had signed up. And you can actually see there is a tablet about this. If you go downtown on what is now like, I don't know exactly what SA4 is calling it, but their new building, it used to be City Flats. This is their kind of dorms. Right there on the edge of that building, next time you walk past it, you'll see there is this like Daughters of the American Revolution tablet in there that talks about, hey, this is on a treaty line. This is a treaty marker like right here on the south side of the Black River, which is kind of neat. So we did see some kind of that economic activity, as I mentioned before, because Detroit burned, that we start to see some people starting to lumber in the area. They're doing a little bit of, there are some saw pits like this. And the very first industry will show up actually just after the War of 1812 in the form of some sawmills. Some of the very first sawmills in the state of Michigan were right basically at the foot of 7th Street, where the 7th Street Bridge is today. On the south side of the Black River, there were some sawmills there. Now, I mentioned before, the War of 1812, this is the one war where Michigan is right on the front lines. Detroit is a great big fort. Mackinac is a great big fort. There's a lot. I would love to talk for a couple hours about the War of 1812. But again, I keep telling myself, Port Huron, right? So the War of 1812 generally doesn't go particularly well for the United States, but in our particular area, they do wind up building Fort Gratiot. So a lot of the area north of the Black River becomes military reserve. So some of the very early economic stimulus of the area is just south of the Black River, because all of that is saved for military fortifications. And in the 1820s, they would build the first lighthouse, 1825, so over 200 years ago. By 1829, they build the current tower where it's located today. And the original tower was, all of it was kind of on the military reserve. This was all federal land, and that military reserve gives that name to Fort Gratiot. It's going to be one of the communities that will actually amalgamate into Port Huron. So again, we see these industrial sawmills pop up at the foot of 7th Street right at the end of the War of 1812. They're fueling building like some of those buildings at Fort Gratiot, for instance. Other military posts as they expand. There is an attractive offer of, hey, if you're right on the river, this is a great place to set up a sawmill, saw some of this. Anywhere you're on the Black River, you throw some of those logs in the river, it can go to one of those sawmills. And especially the ones right there in what is now downtown Port Huron at the mouth of the Black River. That was a great place for the logs to kind of jam up. Sometimes they would cause floods, but that was an easy place to pull the logs out of the river, process them into the lumber that would get used to build buildings all over. Now, this is a reconstruction of Michilimackinac. A lot of the very early buildings in Port Huron would have looked very similar to this, a lot of French architecture, because there were a lot of French residents in this area before there were a lot of New Englanders moving in as well. In 1827, Port Huron would fall within Desmond Township, and this is one of the first times we see Port Huron showing up anywhere on a map officially, and just a couple of log cabins, basically like this at that time in the 1820s. Stevens T. Mason here, our boy governor, one of the youngest governor of any state of all time. I'd love to talk about him for a whole hour too, but he's the one who actually signs some of the paperwork setting aside these 4 townships that would become Port Huron. And this is maybe a little hard to see. We kind of recognize the extent of Port Huron here, and we can kind of see how the city has grown over the time. So in the 1820s and 30s, as Port Huron is starting, the south side really only goes to like Wall Street, right? And there's not much south of there at all at that time. And at that time, we've got Fort Gratiot, the village of Peru, the village of Huron, and the White Platte over here. So all of these villages that are small, independent polities will organize themselves in the 1830s into Port Huron, the village. By 1857, they'll incorporate as the city of Port Huron that we know today. One of my favorite things, those names, some of them are weird, like Peru. In the 1830s, they were doing everything they could to attract residents from places around the rest of the country and to make this place kind of sound kind of foreign and exotic. That was what a lot of land speculators found. So a lot of people giving these names did not even live here. They would just own some of the land. They'd find a name that sounded attractive. They went to the madmen of the 1830s and they said, yeah, South America's like having a moment. And so there are places like Peru gets pulled out of a hat to sound foreign. I'll give you another example. Capac is named after Manco Capac, who was an Incan emperor in the 1400s. Because, when I think of Capac, I think of the Incan Empire, right? My mom always told me it stood for cows and pigs and chickens. So no offense to anyone from Capac here. But that was this interesting way to attract people to the area. They do similar things actually down in Detroit. When you go to IKEA, what city is IKEA in Michigan? Anybody know? Canton was originally Canton. It was supposed to sound like Chinese and foreign and exotic. Nankin Township was Nanjing. It again sounded foreign to attract people to move from the East Coast. And so that's what they did in Port Huron as well. So all of these little polities will finally merge up by the 1830s into the Port Huron that we know today. With the logging industry kind of being the main attraction, as well as some little stores that pop up along the Black River, and the burgeoning steamship industry that's moving up and down the river, there's always a call for more wood. Not only wood to build buildings, wood to fuel those ships, so the logging industry will grow. And that's one of the first industries that we'd also see in the south side of Port Huron, rail industry. The railroad industry is really probably as important to Port Huron as just about any other industry you're going to be able to find. We always think of Port Huron as a seaside town, port, maritime, capital of the Great Lakes, TM, we won that lawsuit, take that Buffalo. This is something that rail is just as important to early Port Huron history as anything else. So you can see things like the Daniel Harrington here is one of these narrow gauge railways that would actually make its way out into the Thumb. It would snake its way from Port Huron, like the Port Huron and Northwestern Railway in the 1880s, that would fuel a lot of that early lumbering industry. So you can go see that finished train over in the Wrigley Center, but it's a really cool picture at the depot down that way. And the rail industry that is so interesting, Port Huron becomes a linchpin through here, and especially the south side of town. This is a greater Grand Trunk Railway, right? So this is a Canadian railway. And a lot of people talk about this, that back in the 1850s, as the Grand Trunk Railway makes its connection here to Port Huron, they'll build at Fort Gratiot. We become one of the most important links and one of the most important bottlenecks in that entire rail line. Here we can see some of the other rail spurs that would make their way south. And you see how many of these are lining up here just south of the Black River. This became a major hub for that Grand Trunk activity. And this is something like, hey, if you really want like an hour and a half on trains, get TJ Gaffney, he can do that. Like standing on his head, he's very good at that. But it's very important to note just how important the rail is to helping Port Huron grow as much as ships. One of the questions that gets, I guess not brought up that much, but I always like to ask people is, what's the most important piece of infrastructure in Port Huron's history? A lot of people will think, the really obvious one is, of course, the Blue Water Bridge. We put that on everything. It's a very close identifier and symbol of our city. But I would argue the most important piece of infrastructure is actually one you can't see. It is the tunnel. There's a lot of people, especially if you're not from Port Huron or you're new here, they don't even realize there is a tunnel. This was the very first subaqueous tunnel, international train tunnel anywhere in the world. When they were finishing this tunnel in 1891, this was on the cover of Scientific American. This was huge news, like international news, an amazing engineering feat. The way they dug this is one of the last major tunnel projects almost dug completely by hand. They had people in there working with that tunnel shield that would push itself forward. They dug the tunnel from each end. This is what's wild to me. They dug the tunnel at each end and met in the middle. That seems like the scariest way to do it. You have to be really confident in your math to do that. But they were less than a quarter inch off when they met in the middle. There are some pioneering techniques they used to dig this tunnel, like the use of compressed air and the tunnel boring shield, where you've got people standing on this kind of little platform, and the shield like pushes them forward with big hydraulic rams as they're scooping out the dirt in front of them. And then as they move behind them, they bolt in sheets of cast iron, creating a perfectly circular tunnel of solid cast iron to keep a lot of that water out. And that was in use for many, many years. Again, we could talk about this all day. I'm giving you guys the 30,000 foot. Let's take a look and come back to this. When this tunnel, initially, steam-powered trains, till they had a number of accidents. They discovered that wasn't a great thing to have. At one point, 6 people died in one pretty horrific accident back in 1906, and they would switch to electric trains to shuttle trains back and forth before then. But they would eventually go to diesel locomotives. They would have a number of this rail switching yard. Because of that bottleneck, Grand Trunk was putting so much traffic through Port Huron that it really impacted, especially the south side of the city. And so a massive rail yard there. Now, one of the areas that also leads to is Port Huron was well connected by rail. We had our own light rail system, and this is one of my favorites. These are the interurban cars. This interurban car, as you can see here, is labeled, it's the South Park car, right? So this South Park car, you could hop on. It would take you from like the train depot at like 24th and Railroad, which there's a huge train depot there. Who remembers that from before, 1975, I think was when they finally tore some of that down. But this would take you into some of the neighborhoods. You could get on that, and that all the way up to the beaches in the north end. It was pretty impressive. Now, the reason we see this South Park is part of the south side of Port Huron. It's not the whole thing. There's more to it than that, but it's one of the most important parts. It's worth taking a look at. South Park was a designed community, which is pretty cool. It's from the Factory Land Company at South Park. And here you can see where to get a home of your own. And lots of great ads that appear in the newspaper. And boy, what an amazing plan. You can see this is actually the original garden plan here for South Park. And a lot of this is still garden today, which is pretty cool. So Eugene Moak incorporated South Park Machine and Supply Company in 1915. He would eventually purchase the assets of South Park Manufacturing Company. So the way this would work, some of these names that we hear, like Little Foundry, the Moaks, these are these major kind of movers and shakers in the community in the 1890s who said the south side of Port Huron was ripe for investment. And they wanted to do things kind of backwards. In a lot of communities, there's a factory that springs up, and everybody builds their house around it once they get a job at a factory. What we did was completely backwards and antithetical. It's much more similar to what we actually do today in modern planning, which is you build a community, and then you find a factory to move in and say, hey, look, we have all these workers here. Bring your factory to town. And that was the plan with this and the Factory Land Company. It was which factory? Who knows? We're going to see which is the best fit for the community. And so they would invite a bunch of them in after building this really nicely plotted and planned community. So it's kind of putting the cart before the horse like you'd see in some other communities at the time. So they would attract other companies like the Port Huron Thresher Company. We'll talk about that. But again, this is just a little part of South Park here. This is part of their advertisement of 3-to-1 advantages for buying in South Park there. So if you buy elsewhere, you just get a house. But if you buy in South Park, not only do you get a house, you get increased demand for labor and an increase in value because of all the factories you're going to attract because of the nice people living there. So it's kind of stacks on top of each other. One of the other really interesting early rules in South Park was that they were not going to allow any saloons. They were going to be a dry community. That lasted for 6 months before somebody's like, nope, we're bringing in a bar. We definitely need a bar. But it's really neat. When you look at like North and South Boulevard, you notice that some of the homes tend to be a little bit larger, they look older. They have that Queen Anne look to them as they were built first, the ones that are closer to like electric and military. But again, some great photos of kind of the neighborhood and some of the factories that would pop up. And there were a number of these smaller factories. Like this picture here, you can recognize a lot of these homes, even if you don't recognize the horse and cart, right? But you can see just how kind of sparsely filled in the area was at the time. We see the river up there, so military and electric are up this way. And you probably all recognize like the house for the church, like it's still there, right? These are kind of landmarks to see some of these homes. Some buildings like this, you're still seeing this factory and just how much this area is filled in. One of the other favorite attractions that a lot of people remember might even have vague memories of today, is one of the other things. In that nice park planned in between North and South Boulevard, they had a bear in a cage as like, hey, what a fun amenity for your neighborhood. So I'm kind of glad that Parks and Rec Department has discontinued the bear in a cage program for improving neighborhood parks. But the cage was there long after the bear. Of course, churches would pop up as well. There are a number of them. I love this Baptist church, what they build in the mission style that's still there, has kind of this Spanish styling to it, which is pretty cool. We also have groups like Omar Thompson here was the director at St. Paul AME. His choir was one of the very first black choirs anywhere in the state to appear on radio. They had a regular radio show in the 1930s on Port Huron radio, which is pretty neat. They'd go on Sunday morning and they'd play the choir programs. But one of the other big churches for the area, of course, is Shiloh Baptist. This is the one that would spawn so many other churches in the neighborhood. And we're going to talk about the number of people who lived here in South Park, because it was a great and diverse group of people who came here from came to Port Huron. But this one was really started back in 1918 because with this industrial growth base. So they plan South Park, the factories pop up, and they attract then additional workers. It's very much a virtuous cycle at the beginning of the 20th century. And a lot of the workers who are moving here, especially right after World War I, lots of black workers were moving in from the South as part of the Great Migration. They're making their way north to northern factories. Port Huron was a really attractive place. And so this is how we get Shiloh Baptist built in town. And so James Clark, the first black pastor they had, all the way back in 1919. And then the church would kind of split. There'd be a couple other churches as it would continue to grow and as the neighborhoods would grow as well, but really kind of the progenitor there. Along with churches, we of course have schools. So this was the old Lincoln School. Anybody remember the Lincoln School? I know a couple people do. So the Lincoln School was built in 1902. And we'd later get, of course, Cleveland School, which we're not too far from here, built in 1924. So Lincoln was torn down back in 1977, but there's a nice little stone there. I love this picture. It's one of my favorites of all these kids, and this person like mid-jump rope. What an amazing picture of the kids outside of the Lincoln School. And so this was a very powerful, a lot of people from the neighborhood remembered that, and it was really a strong connecting bond for South Park specifically. And so a number of these groups like Gene Waddell here, who's sitting there at the Lincoln School, or at least the site of the Lincoln School. But one of the neat things, as I mentioned, I like this ad here. Lincoln School pupils, the most cosmopolitan in city, 6 races represented. So there were people coming from all over the world because of the attraction of these factory jobs in the area. So as I mentioned, Cleveland School, and this is how South Park became kind of a center in Port Huron for a Hispanic community, a black community, lots of different groups. Helen Floyd here is one of these really cool people who I have to mention when talking about the South Side, because I think she is one of the coolest people in town. She got her teaching degree, but at the time she did, they would not hire her at PHASD. There was just an inability for her to get that job. She went down to Haiti, Missouri, where she taught a little bit. And eventually, they relented and they let her be an elementary school teacher. They would not let a black teacher teach at the high school level at that time back in the 1940s. And so she started teaching 5th grade at Cleveland Elementary and would teach for 18 years before she became a principal and stayed principal until 1986. So like if they ever rename Cleveland Elementary, I think it's got to be Helen Floyd would get that name. Pretty cool lady. Yeah. One of those like difficult topics that I always find interesting to dive in. I don't relish it, but I always, part of me, difficult history is always what I find so interesting. One of the reasons that you also saw such a concentration in the South End, and this is where you have black communities, Hispanic communities, in Port Huron, even 100 years ago, back in the 1920s, there were racial covenants when selling homes. There were a lot of neighborhoods on the north side that were off limits. Places like John Asman built a number of different tract homes that were kind of outside areas like Homestead Terrace is one of these neighborhoods. And it's a neighborhood, we don't even use that name anymore. That's just what he called it when he was selling the area. This is the area kind of out by Garfield School that's being expanded in the 1920s. Most of those homes, I've had friends who live up there, and I told them, hey, take a look in your paperwork that you got from the realtor. And they go back and they find the original paperwork in the 1920s. And they'll be like, hey, don't forget, you're not allowed to sell this house to blacks or Jews. They're not allowed. And it was explicit. And this is something the Supreme Court would rule that to be illegal in the 1940s, but it was kept up for a long time even after it was illegal. So there is kind of a legal reason. It's sad to think of that even in Port Huron there was this pretty blatant racism going on that helps to affect the demographics of the town even to this day, which is why sometimes we see such a stark divide between, north side and south side. So some of the first black residents I love, there's a picture of the Rodney family. They moved here actually from Canada in the 1870s, and these were the first black business owners in the city of Port Huron. They operated the Rodney Tea Room, and here's the really ironic part. All the way back in the 1880s and 90s, they lived on the north side, so they were not from the south side. The Rodney Tea Room, we actually have a picture of the inside, which is pretty amazing, and that was in the Ballantyne building. That was up here on the second floor. So that was the first black-owned business in Port Huron, which I think is pretty cool. One of the other people that they tried to attract to South Park, as we mentioned, these factories that keep coming in and are attracting people, is this guy right here. This guy had a fire, destroyed his factory down in Detroit, and he seriously considered moving up here to Port Huron. Anybody recognize him? I'll show you his invention. Here's what he wanted to sell in Port Huron, were these. That is, in fact, Ransom E. Olds. He wanted to headquarter Oldsmobile here in South Park, and at the time, after the Olds Motor Factory works burned down, he said, I will move to South Park, this is about 1901, but I need all of your factories. And so all of the heads of the factory land company got together and they said, he needs all the factories. Should we put all of our eggs in one basket? Cars, who's gonna buy a car, right? I don't know about that. And they told him, nah, beat it, buddy. And so Oldsmobile goes to Lansing and we don't get Oldsmobile. But they're not making Oldsmobiles anymore, so who was right in the long run, right? What's it worth to only get, 90 years of car production? They don't make them anymore, so. But one of those just fun little tidbits you come across when you do some of that research. One of the other big factories we have to talk about in South Park would be the Port Huron Engine Company. This comes out of kind of a number of these different machining companies like Moke Machine, but Port Huron Engine and Thresher is a big one, right? So they're down, they've got quite a bit of land over on the white plot. Part of them is in Port Huron Township, but they're undoubtedly attracting. Port Huron Township and the south side are also very well connected. So there's some of the original factory buildings. This was originally part of the Upton Works that they are able to pull out of a couple different areas, but over on the west side of the state. And they would make not only those big steam traction engines, but all of their accessories as well, like this fun-looking portable sawmill, right? Very cool thing. They even made little toys of Port Huron steam traction engines, which is really cool. If you've never seen one of these, there's a few of them around. You gotta go see one of these in action. There's one, the Port Huron Township Museum has one. I know there's one out at Goodall's that they run. You got to see one of these in action. They're pretty amazing. And these were respected the world around, which is really, really cool. In fact, one of the big selling points they had right around 1905, 1906, something like that, they sold about a dozen of these to South Africa. And you might think, why is that such a big deal? In South Africa, there were so many tariffs and rules and laws about buying from outside the empire, the British Empire. They said that even we can sell to people in the empire. We'll buy this American product rather than a British-made product because they know the quality is so high and right there. So they're really cool tractors. And not only are all of the cool accessories they make, you can use them on the farm. You can use them even to make roads. In fact, one of their first inventions was the big steam traction paver. So a great big steam roller to make a nice paved road. In fact, one of the very first miles of improved paved roads anywhere in the state of Michigan was right out there by the viaduct on 24th. In 1900, they had the world's first, or I guess it was the second annual meeting of the Good Roads Congress International. For people who are interested in building better roads, they had a contest to see which city could sign up more members. And the city that signed up the most members got to hold the conference. Port Huron won. They came, and as part of a fun demonstration, over the 1 week that the conference was here, they paved a mile of road in Port Huron. So that was pretty cool that they were able to do that. There's one other really cool connection with the Port Huron steam traction engine. I've always wondered why, in this era of microbrewery, it was like, why isn't there a Port Huron brewing company, right? Like, that's just like really obvious. There's so many towns that have them. How do we not have one? And there is a Port Huron brewing company, or at least there was. It's in Wisconsin. And I was like, what? Why is there a Port Huron brewing company in Wisconsin? And it is because they are not named for the city of Port Huron. They are named for the Port Huron steam traction engine. They had one of these Port Huron engines, and they named the beer company after the engine. So that's kind of neat, right? So that you can get one of these beers in Wisconsin, and they still make those. They've gone through a couple different companies, but there's still references to that today. There have been some really famous people to call the South Side home over the years. We're talking about this big industrial growth around the turn of the 20th century. And we'll get to the famous guy in just 1 second, because I mentioned before the International Good Roads Conference that was held here, and I did have a picture, I couldn't remember if I put this in, of one of the road rollers that they used to pave that mile of road on 24th Street here in town. So they made 6,000 of these that they sold worldwide. So really cool company. And we had a very, very strong league of bicyclists back in the 1890s and 1900 here in Port Huron, especially in the South End, which is pretty neat. So a lot of the companies would be tied. The Port Huron Steam Thresher Company would kind of go under by like the 1920s. They would divide out into a couple of different smaller companies. South Park Machine and Supply would open by 1915. Here's Moke Machine and Tool. All of these companies were supplying parts not only to each other, but then to the growing auto industry as well. There's a nice little flyer showing some of the factories there from Moke Machine, and you can still see there's that very prominent Moke Machine company. One of the people who knew the Mokes, I mentioned there have been a couple of really famous people who've called the South Side home. These two guys, anybody recognize them? These are the Dodge brothers. Yeah, so John and Horace Dodge, riding in there, Dodge, right? So they would go on to found, of course, Dodge Brothers Automobiles. Dodge was pretty famous, but they would work all the way back in the 1880s. They would move here in 1882, and they would work with the Mokes at a machine tooling company here in the south end of town. One of my favorite facts is that John and Horace were avid high-wheel bicyclers. So I have a penny farthing, one of the big front wheels, little back wheel. They were riding around the south end of town in the 1880s on their great big high wheel. You could have run into the Dodge brothers to see them here in town. And of course, as I mentioned, they would go on to build quite a bit more, but they were famous residents. They even came back to Port Huron in the 19-teens once they were essentially billionaires, and they brought their great big yacht and they docked it right at the foot at the end of North and South Boulevard on the river. They came here with their huge yacht, and I imagine it was a little bit of a changed perspective for them to see what the old neighborhood looked like from when they were here as teenagers growing up, which is pretty cool. Port Huron has had quite a bit of automotive history, actually. The Havers Company was another one of these companies here at the south end of town. These were cars we made here in Port Huron. The Havers Company was over where the now old health department building was. And they made cars for just a few years. There were actually hundreds of car companies at the very beginning of the 20th century. Not all of them made it. So they issued a 201 cubic inch 6-cylinder engine with, get this, 30 horsepower. So that was quite a bit back then, actually. That's not doing too bad at all, but they were pretty expensive. You could get one of these. They called this the Knickerbocker Speedster. This car in 1915 was capable of 70 miles an hour, which do you want to go 70 in that thing? I want to know, what road you're going to do that on, right? And here's the other thing. This car cost $2,485. That was more than your house in South Park at that time. So this was a very expensive car. But there's a very grainy photo of some of the Havers factory there. Sadly, the factory would burn down, and today there are only 3 of these cars left. Terry Ernst has an amazingly restored one of these Havers. There's another that belongs to the Port Huron Museum that is down in the Will St. Clair Museum, kind of in storage storage down that way. There have been some other car companies that have touched on the area. This is, of course, Henry Ford, who a lot of the companies in South Park are doing business for once Ford Motor Company becomes pretty big, making a lot of those car parts for. And this is C. Harold Wills, who was involved in the Wills St. Clair Company. He actually got his start at Ford, and interestingly, if you've ever seen that Ford logo, you've seen some of the handiwork of C. Harold Wills, because that's his handwriting. He writes out the Ford script, which is pretty neat. There have been famous people. There have also been infamous people who have wound up in South Park. Who recognizes him? Yeah, it's John Dillinger. So John Dillinger didn't necessarily, there's some, figurings and some myths about him, but Dillinger would famously go on kind of a major crime spree in the 30s. He would be arrested and placed in jail in 1934 in the Lake County Jail. This is him with Sheriff Lillian Hawley and the chief prosecutor, and yeah, being pretty chummy here for the photo for a guy who, is in jail. Lillian Hawley said her jail was escape-proof, but when Dillinger wound up in there, it's kind of a long and interesting story, but he would wind up whittling himself a little wooden gun, and when somebody stepped into his cell to bring him some food, Dillinger shoves the little wooden gun in his back, and it's enough that he has enough of a reputation. The guard did not want to take a chance. He gives up his gun, gives up his keys, and Dillinger is able to make his escape from that jail. There's quite a bit about I like they carved in here Colt 38 later on, patented March 1938 on the little piece of wooden gun there. But he would escape with a guy named Herbert Youngblood. They would actually tie up a number of the cops, throw him in a jail cell, grab a couple of guns, liberate. They went into the garage, and they asked the mechanic there, who's got the fastest car? And they said, it's the sheriff, Lillian Hawley. They said, good, get the keys and get in. And this is her car. They would abandon it a few miles outside of the jail, but they would escape and cross state lines, which would make this one of the first major high-profile federal cases that the FBI would get involved in. So everyone in the country was looking for Dillinger and his accomplice, Herbert Youngblood. And Youngblood would make his way to Port Huron, right? So spoiler alert, but Youngblood would make his way here, and he would rob Pearl Abraham's grocery store. He went in, he was a little drunk, he was kind of belligerent, he refused to pay for his groceries. He says, bad men don't buy groceries. And so they call the police, and when the sheriff and the deputies get there, they are able to disarm him of a revolver, but he had another 10-shot automatic pistol, 1907 Savage, in his back pocket that he's able to pull out. He fires all 10 shots. There's a fusillade of fire going back and forth. A couple of deputies are hit. One is killed. It's an absolute bloodbath. If you want to know a little bit more about this and see some artifacts, you can go visit the jail. They actually have, in the jail, they have some of the guns used in this gunfight, and they have something like the shirt that Sheriff in Antwerp was wearing. He was shot through the arm and it bled all over his shirt. He fortunately survived. So Charles Kavanaugh was killed because he was shot through both lungs. It was just an absolute bloodbath of a fight. But after they capture him, they actually shut down all of St. Clair County. They're terrified that John Dillinger is here. Youngblood is mortally wounded. They take him to the hospital. When he gets to the hospital, as nasty as this is, they essentially torture him to death because they're like, hey, where's Dillinger? We figured out who you are. Where is Dillinger? You escaped with him a few days ago. You have to tell us where he is. And Youngblood essentially led them on a wild goose chase. And so yeah, he's here in town and he's got more guns than the army and you'll never take him alive. They closed, this is before the Blue Water Bridge opened, so they closed every road out of St. Clair County, closed all the ferries, and for about 48 hours, they were convinced John Dillinger was here in Port Huron and they're searching for him. He was over in Wisconsin, and Youngblood had no idea where he was. But the spotlight was on town, and of course, Dillinger would be killed by the FBI just a couple of weeks later. So one of the most exciting things to happen in the south side of town, world famous kind of gun battle there in the middle of the 1930s. My favorite news headline about the south side of town comes from 1947. Which is, in fact, 2 days before okay, you all laugh. But listen to this. This was 2 days before the crash at Roswell. Right. When I first read this headline, I figured everybody was like, oh, somebody's a copycat, somebody saw a UFO, or they read about them and they think they saw one. Oh, no. This was 2 days before the crash. An entire family on Thompson Street went out and saw flying saucers and reported this. And this was, front page of the Times Herald. And then 2 days later is the big crash. This was between 10:30 and 11, the night of July 4th. Residents of the 1600 block of Thomas Street watched a glowing circle darted across the sky in erratic patterns, unlike any aircraft anyone had ever seen. There were no fireworks that night. They had been, consolidated just like around here. It's a weird Port Huron tradition that, sometimes there's 4th of July, but usually because of Canada Day and the Blue Water Festival, we're not big on 4th of July fireworks here. So there weren't fireworks that night. They saw something, right? Witnesses described it as aerial leapfrog with objects crisscrossing each other in the sky. So what do you think of that? You think one of those maybe wound up at Roswell? Who knows? But it was definitely before that Roswell crash. One of the other things, we're getting pretty close to modern history, but some things I just have to mention or touch on as we kind of wrap things up here. One of the other really cool things that we've had on the South Side, we mentioned before, there are people from all over who were moving here. And by the 1950s, there were a large Hispanic population to move here, and a large number that did not speak English. And so the Archbishopric in Detroit set up the Our Lady of Guadalupe Hispanic Mission in town. So there was a church that offered services in Spanish for a growing Spanish-speaking population, not only here in Port Huron, but in the larger Thumb. And this is a great picture. This is the Keel found this. They dug up the 1988 directory, and some of these names are a lot of people who've been longtime residents recognize a lot of these people. Who recognizes somebody from the list here, right? A lot of people. And so this, they served for a very long time. Today it's home to that Two-Gen Learning Center from Literacy and Beyond. But they shut its doors in May of 2017. But they were another long-time staple and kind of served as a community center, kind of like the Harvey that we're in today. One of the worst natural disasters, again, just to touch on, 1953, the same year Guadalupe Mission opens, Port Huron was hit by a tornado, and a particularly vicious one that did a lot of damage at the south side of town. I mean, $2.6 million in 1953, that is a lot of money and a lot of devastation throughout the south end of Port Huron. So the south side, with all of its heavy industry popping up, did see some consequences of that. Again, we're getting really close to modern day. There were groups that were dedicated to the South Side by the 1970s and 80s, groups that had started to come together to advocate for the South Side, specifically a South Side Coalition. There was a big fight over a recycling plant that was going in town. It was zoned for industry. There was already a waste paper plant, but when they wanted to add some kind of heavier metals, they knew there were going to be a lot of dump trucks and garbage trucks coming into town. And a lot of people didn't want this right on 28th Street, so close to so many people's homes. And they got together. They did picketing. They approached the city council. It's really a pretty amazing amount of community action to keep some of those factories out for an area that had been so built on factories. People realized increasingly maybe it's not so fun to live across the street from a foundry anymore. And so we start to see advocacy for the South Side starting in the 70s and 80s. The 1960s, they would set aside Knox Field, but in the 80s there were plans to put factories there. Again, the community comes together to keep some of those factories out and keep that a wonderful park. One of the other big changes to the south side of the town that comes in the 60s and 70s is the Public Housing Commission. So public housing really starts in 1965, but by 1970 they would actually build places like Dull Hut here, Dull Hut Village, which is named for the French guy who was here all the way back in the 1680s to kind of bring things almost full circle. So they would build this kind of low-income housing, subsidized housing with money from the federal government that really helps to dominate and increase the population on the south side of town. They've decreased the density a little bit on these, spread them out a little bit, so there's not quite as many as there were when that was initially built back in 1970. But one of those other defining features of kind of the south side is that we have this affordable housing for people to live here, and some of the amazing people that really helped out the area. So like the James Leonard Center, built in 1982, attached to Cleveland School, and of course we're here in the Harvey Center today. So some of these really cool ways for the community to have really coalesced together into a discrete community. There have been things like the Southside Jazz Fest, the jams. There have been some really cool pictures over the years. You dive back in. And again, I figured by this point that once we're into like the 90s, the 2000s, a lot of this is like living memory. This is things that you folks all lived through and can remember a lot of this and recognize some of these pictures. We're, of course, Again, that's from the Jazz Festival on the south side, which I just love that picture. We're here in the Harvey Reinvestment Center, where the City Council has approved that purchase. So this is one of the biggest changes to the area. So this was built in 1994 and opened in 1995. And Harvey was on the Housing Commission all the way back in 1962, so helped to get a lot of that public housing units built. So very appropriate that this building was named after him when the Housing Commission built that, and that he keeps his name. Here's the coolest thing I found out about Mr. Harvey here when I was doing a little bit of this research. This is one of those, like, I didn't know how to fit this in. But not only was he very involved in public housing, he was also very involved in the Masons. He was a very prominent Mason. He was I want to get this right, I put it in my, he owned the Red Shingle, so that was his business, all right? He is on the Housing Commission, but all of his leisure time is dedicated to the Masons, and he was the Grand High Priest of the Royal Arch Masons of the United States, Bahamas, and Canada. That's pretty cool, right? So, cool guy. So, I don't know, like I said, you find out sometimes those tidbits and what do you do with that? So how about the future of South Park? I got the last couple of slides here. How many of you have been watching this project with some interest, right? This is pretty exciting to see down at Connors Street. This is the Walkers are doing a lot of work on one of these old screw factories, one of these old industrial buildings, and it's being revitalized because we've realized that as we've shifted away from a lot of this heavy industry and machine-based economy, you wind up, like so many Rust Belt cities, with these old factories. What do you do with them? And boy, when I saw this was just a rendering of Mahogany Bay here, what this is going to look like, this drive-through restaurant, bar, hangout spot, that's going to be pretty cool. I'm pretty excited for that. And I think that can really, a lot of people have talked about how this might help to revitalize South Park as a neighborhood even more so. And there's a lot of people committed to that. In fact, one of the big, just the last couple of years, we have the South Side Initiative that has showed up. And so there are a lot of people taking a great deal of interest in the future of this area and the South Side in particular. So, the future, my specialty is the past, of course, not the future. I will leave that up to everyone here in the room, right? We all kind of got to work together on that one. But I'd say the future looks pretty bright for the South Side, all things considered. It's pretty exciting stuff. So again, my name is Andrew Kercher. It's been an honor and absolute privilege to get to talk to you about some of these highlights. I hope that you at least learned a couple new stories, maybe were reminded of a few others. You've become interested in some of this. I'll tell you about some of these resources. I'm always happy to help. You can always get a hold of me, andrewlkercher@gmail.com. Kercher.info is my website. I speak all over the state. Those are just a few of the topics I do. I'm doing a whole bunch more lectures for the library system. Again, it means so much to me that on a nice spring night, all of you would choose to spend it with me and interested in history. So thank you all so much for coming out tonight. I'll put in one more quick plug again. Thank you so much to the city and the Parks and Rec Department, James Street, Cynthia, the whole City Council for working to bring this building. I know this building is available for community events. You can get in touch with them through the Parks and Rec Department because this is an amazing facility. They've done an amazing job on it. So enjoy it on your way out. There are bathrooms to your left as you exit here. Like I said, thank you so much, and we'll be in touch. I'll see you around town. How about that?